Hi, fifth graders. I am Mrs. Lanchels, and I am going to be teaching you social studies this year, as well as science. The way we're going to do social studies this year is through historical fiction read-alouds, which I'm really excited about because I've chosen a lot of really great books for us to explore and talk about history through. The first book that we're going to read is The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle by Avi. This was really fun for me to pick because usually the fourth grade teachers read this at the end of the school year, but because of our school closure in the spring, they didn't get a chance to do this with you guys as fourth graders. So it's a great book for fifth grade too because it is about a girl who travels on a ship across the Atlantic Ocean, and that transatlantic travel is something that we talk about a lot with exploration and the settling of the colonies. So I'm going to read the back of the book, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what was going on at the time that this book is set in, and then we're just going to read the first chapter. So at the back of the book, it says, "Treason and treachery on the high seas." And I think I'll show you the front of the book while I read this. 13-year-old Charlotte Doyle is excited to return home to Rhode Island from her school in England during the summer of 1832. But when the two families she was supposed to travel with mysteriously cancel their trips, Charlotte finds herself the lone passenger on a long sea voyage with a cruel captain and a mutinous crew. Worse yet, soon after stepping aboard the ship, she becomes enmeshed in a conflict between them. What begins as an eagerly anticipated ocean crossing turns into a harrowing journey where Charlotte gains a villainous enemy and is put on trial for murder. So Avi says that this is almost kind of like a mystery in a way, but has a lot of suspense and a lot of historical information in it. So I'm pretty excited to read it. In 1832, something you should know is that, this was after the American Revolution, and New England, the New England Anti-Slavery Society was just formed in Boston. It was also a time when Charles Darwin, who is a famous naturalist, was doing a lot of exploration and making a lot of scientific discoveries in the field of biology, nature. Cholera was a sickness that was starting to show up in Europe, and we know that that is a sickness that a lot of people on ships had exposure to and died from. The president was Andrew Jackson. The first streetcar was running in America, and this was also a time when westward expansion was still happening. So westward expansion started in the early 1800s, and it kind of tapered off in the 1890s. So this was the time where a lot of people were starting to move west from the colonies. All right, so we're going to get started on our book. Okay, so the beginning of this book, Charlotte Doyle gives us an important warning. Not every 13-year-old girl is accused of murder, brought to trial, and found guilty. But I was just such a girl, and my story is worth relating, even if it did happen years ago. Be warned, however, this is no story of a bad boy. Know what Katie did. If strong ideas and actions offend you, read no more. Find another companion to share your idle hours. For my part, I intend to tell the truth as I lived it. But before I begin relating what happened, you must know something about me, as I was in the year 1832, when these events transpired or happened. At the time, my name was Charlotte Doyle, and though I have kept the name, I am not, for reasons you will soon discover, the same Charlotte Doyle. How shall I describe the person I once was? At the age of 13, I was very much a girl, having not yet begun to take the shape, much less the heart, of a woman. Still, my family dressed me as a young woman, bonnet covering my beautiful hair, full skirts, high-button shoes, and you may be sure, white gloves. I certainly wanted to be a lady. It was not just my ambition, it was my destiny. I embraced it wholly, gladly, with not an untoward thought of anything else. In other words, I think that at the time of these events, I was not anything more or less than what I appeared to be, an acceptable, ordinary girl of parents in good standing. Though American-born, I spent the years between my 6th and 13th birthdays in England. My father, who engaged in the manufacture of cotton goods, so he made cotton goods, functioned as an agent for an American business there. But in the early spring of 1832, he received an advancement and was summoned home. So they had to go back to America for her dad's work in the cotton industry. My father, an ardent believer in regularity and order, decided it would be better if I finished out my school term rather than break it off mid-year. My mother, whom I never knew to disagree with him, accepted my father's decision. I would follow my parents as well as my younger brother and sister to our true home, which was Providence, Rhode Island. So her parents wanted her to finish her schooling in England that year before she returned to America. So they went ahead of her, and she had to travel alone later after her school year was done in England. Lest you think that my parents' judgment was rash in allowing me to travel without them, I will show you how reasonable, even logical, their decision was. First, they felt that by my remaining a boarder at the Barrington School for Better Girls, I would lose no school time. Second, I would be crossing the Atlantic, a trip that could last anywhere from 1 to 2 months during the summer when no formal education took place, so she wouldn't miss any school. Third, I was to make my voyage upon a ship owned and operated by my father's firm. Fourth, the captain of the ship had acquired a reputation for quick and profitable Atlantic crossings. Then there was this. 2 families known to my parents had also booked passage on the ship. The adults had promised to function as my guardians. Having been told only that these families included children, 3 lovely girls and 1 charming boy, I had looked forward to meeting them more than anything else. So when you consider that I had but dim memories of making the crossing to England when I was 6, you will understand that I saw the forthcoming voyage as all a lark. A large, beautiful boat, jolly sailors, no school to think about, companions of my own age. One more point. I was given a volume of blank pages, a journal, and instructed to keep a daily journal of my voyage across the ocean so that the writing of it should prove of educational value to me. Indeed, my father warned me that not only would he read the journal and comment upon it, but he would pay particular attention to spelling, not my strongest suit. Keeping the journal, then, is what enables me to relate now in perfect detail everything that transpired or happened during that fateful voyage across the Atlantic Ocean in the summer of 1832. So this is part 1, chapter 1. Just before dusk in the late afternoon of June 16, 1832, I found myself walking along the crowded docks of Liverpool, England, following a man by the name of Grummage. Though a business associate of my father, Mr. Grummage was, like my father, a gentleman. It was he my father delegated to make the final arrangements for my passage to America. He was also to meet me when I came down from school on the coach, then see me safely stowed aboard the ship that my father had previously selected. Mr. Grummage was dressed in a black frock coat with a stovepipe hat that had added to his considerable height. His somber, sallow face registered no emotion. His eyes might have been those of a dead fish. "Miss Doyle," he said, as I stepped from the Liverpool coach. "Yes, sir. Are you Mr. Grummage?" "I am." "Pleased to meet you," I said, dipping a curtsy. "Quite," he returned. "Now, Miss Doyle, if you would be so good as to indicate which is your trunk, I have a man here to carry it. Next, please oblige me by following, and everything shall be as it's meant to be. Might I say goodbye to my chaperone? Is it necessary? She's been very kind. Make haste, then. In a flutter of nervousness, I identified my trunk, threw my arms about Miss Emerson, my sweet companion for the trip down, and bid her a tearful farewell. Then I rushed after Mr. Grummage, who had already begun to move on. A rough-looking porter laboring behind carried my trunk upon his back. So Mr. Grummage is kind of making her hurry up, even though she wants to say goodbye to her traveling companion, Miss Emerson, and then Mr. Grummage is being followed by this kind of rough-looking man who is carrying her big trunk on his back. Our little parade reached dockside in good order. There I became instantly agog at the mass of ships that lay before us, masts and spars thick as the bristles on a brush. Everywhere I looked, I saw mountains of rare goods piled high, bales of silken tobacco, chests of tea, a parrot, a monkey. Oh yes, the smell of the sea was intoxicating to one who knew little more than the smell of trim, cut lawns in the fields of the Barrington School. Then, too, the surging crowds of workers, sailors, and merchants, all rough-hewn, brawny men, created an exotic late-afternoon hubbub. All in all, it was a most delicious chaos, which, while mildly menacing, was no less exciting because of that. Indeed, in some vague way, I had the feeling that it was all there for me, so it was very exciting. Lots of people, animals, all these big ships. So she was really, really excited and kind of overwhelmed by it. Mr. Grummage, sir, I called over the din. What is the name of the ship I'm to sail on? Mr. Grummage paused briefly to look at me as though surprised I was there, to say nothing of asking a question. Then, from one of his pockets, he drew a screw of paper. Squinting at it, he pronounced, "The Seahawk." Is she British or American? American. A merchant ship? To be sure. How many masts? I don't know. Will the other families already be on board? I should think so, he answered, exasperation in his voice. For your information, Miss Doyle, I received word that departure was being put off, but when I checked with the captain directly, he informed me that there must have been some misunderstanding. The ship is scheduled to leave with the first tide tomorrow morning, so there can be no delay. To prove the point, he turned to move again. I, however, was unable to quell my excited curiosity and managed to slip in one more question. Mr. Grummage, sir, what is the captain's name? Mr. Grummage stopped again, frowned in an irritated fashion, but all the same consulted his paper. Captain Jaggery, he announced, and once more turned to go. Here, the porter exclaimed suddenly. He had come up close and overheard our talk. Both Mr. Grummage and I looked about. Did you say Captain Jaggery? The porter demanded. Are you addressing me? Mr. Grummage inquired, making it perfectly clear that if so, the porter had committed a serious breach of decorum. So the porter shouldn't have asked him that. I was, the man said, talking over my head, and I'm asking if I heard right when you said we were going to a ship mastered by a certain Captain Jaggery. He spoke the name Jaggery if it was something positively loathsome or horrible. I was not addressing you, Mr. Grummage informed the man. But I hears you all the same, the porter went on, and so saying he swung my trunk down upon the dock with such a ferocious crack that I feared it would snap in two. I don't intend to take one more step toward anything to do with a Mr. Jaggery, not for double gold, not one more step. See here, Mr. Grummage cried with indignation, you undertook— Never mind what I undertook, the man retorted. It's worth more to me to avoid that man than to close with your coin. And without another word, he marched off, so he was going to have nothing to do with that captain. Stop, I say stop, Mr. Grummage called. It was in vain. The porter had gone, and quickly at that. Mr. Grummage and I looked at each other. I hardly knew what to make of it, nor clearly did he. Yet he did what he had to do. He surveyed the area in search of a replacement. There, young man, he cried to the first who passed by, a huge laboring fellow in a smock. Here's a shilling if you can carry this young lady's trunk. The man paused, looked at Mr. Grummage, at me, at the trunk. That? He asked disdainfully. I will be happy to add a second shilling, I volunteered, thinking that a low offer was the problem. Miss Doyle, Mr. Grummage snapped, let me handle this. 2 shillings? The workman said quickly. 1, Mr. Grummage countered. 2, the workman repeated, and he held out his hand to Mr. Grummage, who gave him but 1 coin. Then the man turned and extended his hand to me. Hastily, so slowly, she began to extract a coin from her reticule. So from the stuff she had with her. I did promise, I whispered, and dropped the coin into the man's upturned palm. Right you are, miss, said the porter with a tip of his hat. May the whole world follow your fashion. This commendation of my principles of moral goodness brought a blush of pleasure that I could hardly suppress. As for Mr. Grummage, he made a point of clearing his throat to indicate disapproval. Now then, the porter asked, where does this young lady require this? Never mind where, Mr. Grummage snapped. Along the docks here, and I'll tell you when we arrive. The money pocketed, the man lumbered over to my trunk, swung it to his shoulder with astonishing ease, considering the trunk's weight and size, and said, lead on. Mr. Grummage, wasting no more time and perhaps fearful of the consequence of more talk, started off again. After guiding us through a maze of docks and quays, he came to a stop. With a half turn, he announced, there she sits, and gestured to a ship moored to a slip before us. So he was pointing to this ship that the Seahawk was the name of the ship, and it was tied up to the dock. I had hardly looked where he pointed when I heard the thump behind. Startled, I turned and saw that the new man, the new porter, the one we had just hired, had taken one look at the Seahawk, set down the trunk, and, like the first, run off without any word of explanation at all. Mr. Grummage barely glanced over his shoulder at the hastily departing worker. In exasperation, he said, Miss Doyle, you will wait for me here. And with rapid strides, he took himself up the gangplank and onto the Seahawk, where he disappeared from my view. I stood my place, more than ever wanting to go aboard and meet the delightful children who would be my traveling companions. But as I waited on the dock for something like a half an hour, all but unmoving in the waning light of the day, I could only gaze upon the ship. So Mr. Grummage marched onto the ship to figure out what was going on, and Charlotte was left with her trunk sitting on the dock for more than a half an hour, just by herself. To say that I was unduly alarmed when I examined the Seahawk would be nonsense. I had not the remotest superstitious notion of what was to come, so she had no idea that something bad was going to happen. Nothing of the kind. No, the Seahawk was a ship, like countless others I had seen before, or for that matter have seen since. Oh, perhaps she was smaller and older than I had anticipated, but nothing else. Moored to the dock, she rode the swell easily. Her standard rigging, tarred black for protection against the salt sea, rose above me, dark ladders to an increasingly dark sky, and indeed her royal yards seemed lost in the lowering night. Her sails tied up, that is reefed, looked like sleeves of new-fallen snow on the lofty trees. So Charlotte in this book has a little, it's called a appendix, and she shows us a diagram of the ship. So here's the diagram of the ship, and I'll post this in our folder for class so you can look at it more closely. So that's what the ship looks like, and then here is another one of the ship with the deck. And let me go back to my page. Briefly, the Seahawk was what is known as a brig, a two-masted ship, perhaps some 700 tons in weight, 107 feet stern to bow, 130 feet deck to mainmast cap. She was built, perhaps, in the late 18th or early 19th century. Her hull was painted black, her bulwarks white, these being the ordinary colors, so it was a black and white ship. Her two masts, raked slightly back, were square-rigged. She had a bowsprit, too, one that stood out from her bow like a unicorn's horn. So it was like a big unicorn's horn type of thing that stuck out from the front. Indeed, the one unique aspect of the ship was a carved figurehead of a pale white seahawk beneath the bowsprit. The wings were thrust back against the bow. Its head extended forward, beak wide open, red tongue protruding as if screaming. In the shadowy light that twisted and distorted its features, I was struck by the notion that this figure looked more like an angry, avenging angel than a docile bird. So it was a seahawk with kind of like a angry facial carving. The dock side was deserted and growing darker. I felt like taking myself up the gangplank in search of Mr. Grummage, but alas, my good manners prevailed. I remained where I was, standing in a dreamlike state, thinking I know not what. But gradually, like a telescope being focused, I began to realize I was watching something clinging to one of the mooring ropes on the ship's stern. It reminded me of a picture I had once seen of a sloth, an animal that hangs upside down upon jungle vines. But this, I gradually perceived, was a man. He appeared to be shimmying himself from the docks up to the Seahawk. Even as I realized what I was seeing, he boarded the ship and was gone. I had no time to absorb that vision before I heard angry voices. Turning, I saw Mr. Grummage appear at the topgallant rail, engaged in an argument with someone I could not see. My gentleman repeatedly looked down at me, and so, I thought, gesticulated in my direction as if I was the subject of a heated discussion. So Mr. Grummage and a man were having a discussion, and she was pretty sure it was about her. At last, Mr. Grummage came down to the dock. As he drew nearer, I saw that his face was flushed with an angry eye that alarmed me. "Is something amiss, or is something wrong?" she whispered. "Not at all," he snapped. "All is as planned. You have been expected. The ship's cargo is loaded. The captain is ready to sail. But," he trailed off, looked back at the ship, then turned again to me. "It's just that, you see, those two families, the ones you would have been traveling with, they have not arrived." "But they will," I said, trying to compose myself. "That's not entirely certain," Mr. Grummage allowed. "The second mate informs me that one family sent word that they could not reach Liverpool in time. The other family has a seriously ill child. There is concern that she should not be moved." Again, Mr. Grummage glanced over his shoulder at the Seahawk, as if, in some fashion, these events were the ship's fault. Turning back to me, he continued, "As it stands, Captain Jaggery will accept no delay of departure. Quite proper. He has his orders." "But Mr. Grummage, sir," I asked in dismay, "what shall I do?" "Do? Miss Doyle, your father left orders that you were to travel on this ship at this time. I have very specific written orders in that regard. No, he left no money to arrange otherwise. As for myself," he said, "I'm off for Scotland tonight on pressing business." "But surely," I cried, frustrated by the way Mr. Grummage was talking as much as by his news, "surely I mustn't travel alone." "Miss Doyle," he returned, "being on a ship with the full complement of captain and crew could hardly be construed as traveling alone." But that would be all men, Mr. Grummage, and I'm a girl. It would be wrong," I cried in absolute confidence that I was echoing the beliefs of my beloved parents. So she was saying, "No, I have to travel with that family. They were supposed to be my guardians, and then I would have other girls on the ship with me, and it wouldn't just be men and me." Mr. Grummage drew himself up. "Miss Doyle," he said loftily, "in my world, judgments as to rights and wrongs are left to my Creator, not to children. Now be so good as to board the Seahawk at once." So he ordered her onto the boat. So that's the end of chapter 1. And so what we're going to do is I have a discussion question for you to answer. And that will either be on Schoology or I will get it out to you. And then the next time we read, on our chart here, we'll summarize what has happened first, and then we will go on to chapters 2 and 3. of our story. Okay, I will see you next time.